take over proceedings from here. If she's here, she was right here a moment ago, but I'm sure she'll be back in 1 second. There she is. All right. Sorry. So, without further ado, Florence, it's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our panel discussion. It's entitled, as you know, Take Power, which I take as an invitation to reflect on the power of words and literature to change the balance between the powerful and the obscure, or the power of imagination, metaphors, to transform our lives inside a given social and historical framework. The Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer used to say, writers can't change the world, they can't even make it worse. I think he was being a bit provocative. In the part of the world where I come from, which is Paris, we know since Camus and Sartre and many others that words and power are related. But, and this is why this session is very interesting to me, we know little about how they relate and what's happening in the other end, at the other end of the planet. For example, in Australia. What is Aboriginal poetry? What does it consist in? What does one call the stolen generations? How does a poet today connect to her or his Aboriginal heritage? This is what we're going to tackle, and I'm very happy to introduce our three panelists. Ali Cobby Eckerman, hello. You were born Ali, you were born in Australia in 1963 in an Aboriginal family, but very soon, as a baby, you've been adopted by the Eckerman family. After some years, you were able to find your biological mother. I think you were 34. And now, regularly, you visit your traditional family in rural and remote South Australia. Your first book of poetry, called Little Bit Long Time, was published in 2009. Since this, you've published many other books, including a verse novel in 2011, and your last publication, I just saw there, Too Afraid to Cry. Lionel Fogarty, am I pronouncing right? You are also an Indigenous Australian poet and a political activist. Born in 1958, you've published 5 collections of poems, and you've also been involved with non-for-profit poetry organization, and you'll tell us more about this. And Caryl Ferey, well, now I'm sure I pronounce it right because you come from the same part of the world as I do. You're a French crime writer, born in Normandy in 1967, brought up in Brittany, and you have published, what, about a dozen novels, which are mainly crime novels, but not only. We'll discuss this later. And including the most famous one, which is Zulu, which has been made into a film with Forest Whitaker. And you won a large number of literary awards, and you write for children, etc. So maybe I would like to start with our two Australian guests by asking them, you know, for a European audience like, or European reader like me, it would be useful if you could tell us a bit what Aboriginal poetry consists in, and then I'm going to join you.
For me, Aboriginal poetry is way of healing my past. As mentioned, I was 34 when I found my mother, and 4 years later I found my only born child, my son. So poetry initially was a way to make sense of the world that was completely turning around. I'm lucky because I grew up in a culture that was not my own, but I was given a second chance to find my family and be immersed in my culture because it was still unbroken. And so heading out into the deserts of northwest South Australia, very, very remote area, and spending 10 years with the old women gave me back a sense of who I was born to be. And in that, what is commonly known as an oral storytelling tradition, I was writing down stories that I heard around the campfire, this tradition of beautiful words, mostly around the campfire or when we're travelling to go and get bush tucker, all the best times, that there was always stories shared about that mountain in the distance who was someone's grandfather and the story of that, or the spring where we stop and get water and the cultural story towards that. And so my poetry is quite contemporary, but my traditional family didn't really have a voice. An example of that is that we would be, we'd all get dressed up and we'd drive into town to go to a restaurant, and because of the colour of their skin, because they're traditional people, they weren't allowed in the restaurant and I was. And so the poetry became more important than just a cathartic process for myself, but also wanting to tell the world that here was a beautiful culture. Here I'd been looking for 34 years in all these different corners and areas of life, and here was this beautiful culture that had saved me and given me the quality of life to achieve whatever I wanted. The achievements are beyond my dreams, but the strength of our people and the way that they put the world into thought, the way they think about the world, was something that I'd always sort of instinctively dreamt about, and here it was in the reality. And I think that's the strength of Aboriginal poetry. Most of the world, most of Australia, they don't know a damn thing about us really, apart from what the anthropologists wrote down and missionaries wrote down, but they don't know the essence of us. And Aboriginal poetry is sharing the essence of us.
Okay, thank you, Ali. And now I'm turning to you, Lionel. Ali underlined the fact that writing had healing virtues, and that her poetry was a way to give a voice to those who hadn't got a voice. Do you agree with that, and how would you define your own poetry?
Yeah, well, in terms of poetry, in Australia, I belong to 4,000 Aboriginal authors in Australia. That's what I identify with. And we've been conquering English ever since the English people came to Australia. I'll just quote out here. Well, anyway, in about 1800s, around about 1779 or something like that, Bennelong was one of the first Aboriginal people in Sydney there that was taken on a ship over to England. political writing, it's cultural writing, and poetry really stems from song, dance, and artwork, and our message sticks, what we have, what we carve into. These are all like poetry to us. Then, like I come from a reserve, an Aboriginal commission, where about 37 different tribes were sent to, and were detribalized, denoted tribes, and weren't allowed to speak their language or practice their culture or anything like that. And so it was difficult. It was done in a whispery kind of language experience, because we had a lot of different customs that were all shoved into one community, and we had different dialects. But when the white man then started to rule us, basically, and come and get cheap labor and take them out into the stations, homesteads and all that, with the mothers and the fathers, the uncles and aunties, all that going out into the station. Then they came back. Then they more or less was allowed by the authorities to speak Oka language, broken English, pidgin English and things like that, which was the Aussie kind of way of mate and g'day and all that, will start to come back around the campfires. And this is where lad speaking, like ring barking, kind of, they call it ring barking in Australia, where it's like a yarn kind of thing. So people are expressing themselves out aloud in using that English as a tool in terms of thing. So basically, you might as well say that storytelling was very well known in my community and in a lot of Aboriginal reserves. Painting and all that were being done, but when authorities were coming up the road, up the laneway, I mean, our people chucked the painting in the fire because the authorities were going to take it. And this is what reflected to me. But coming away from the mission, I think that being involved with the political movement in Brisbane, because you find out where your mob come from, because you have a roots. That the reserve where we were all sent is not where we all came from. So mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers put it into your heart to find your roots of where you're from. So my roots were Malanjali Yagara mob and Kajala mob up in Charter Stairs in North Queensland, and Yagara Malanjali is down in the Bowders of Brisbane area, near the Gold Coast of South East Queensland. So basically going down there and then trying to track down your mob, and then meeting up that way, you came in contact with politics, with the political movement, about land rights, about housing, medical, legal. None of this was happening in the 70s when I came out of there. But we were told not to really go near these kind of people because politics was nothing much. But I had a little bit of culture in me, and some of the old people were coerced into Christianity, but they were using Christianity as a way of speaking out. At this time, you had some of the activists at that time were writing political statements and political things that were happening in the community. I mean, this didn't influence me that much, but culture did. I mean, people were still trying to revitalize some of the culture and the dancing and that. So I inflicted with that. And then basically getting involved with the political movement meant that I was forced to get on charges, like conspiring against the state, way back in 1976, 75, 74, around that time. So that kind of built me up into understanding the legal system. Same with a lot of other young Aboriginal people who had been chucked into jail for no reasons at all. This stimulated us to understand the white man law, and how the white man law was very oppressive to us. We already knew that anyway, because you had to get permission to get out of the mission, permission to get back in. It was more like we were reading signs, like street signs, and what's the name of the train stations and things like that. I mean, basically how I started my thing is through speaking, is through listening to rallies, listening to marches, and listening to protest people in the streets and that. And I think that poetry really came from that, and to understanding of people like Ujuru Nunako, Jack Davis. These were old Aboriginal writers from the 60s and from the 50s and that, and they were producing fantastic books and fantastic poetry in Australia in conquering English.
This Lionel will go deeper into this culture later on, but
I found that poetry to Aboriginal people at that time in protest was to conquer the English so that we can introduce little bits of our languages.
you wrote a lot, especially on Maori culture, which is, of course, not the same, but not very far away in terms of geography. So tell us about that.
Yeah. I traveled the world when I was 20 years old. Discovered the Maori culture in New Zealand, and to my mind, it changed all my life. This travel, like all the teenagers, I had a very serious problems. But when you discover people who sleep in the streets or live in awful things, I think all my problems finally is not very important, just a bit ridiculous. And when I discovered the Maori culture, it was difficult because it's very tough people, and most of the time, the first Maori I met, it was in a pub or in a nightclub, and it was just the big man like this. You can go, no, you can go. So it was a very it's not, for the culture. It was it's nothing. So I had to discover somebody who can introduce me to the Maori people, and the Maori used to meet in a cold place in Maori, and it's a place where they can speak their own language, and not only the English, but their own language, the Maori language, and all the culture. They will do school too, and they make a war dance called Aka. And I met, it was an old lady, old French lady, but a white one, and she told me, yes, you have a meeting with a man called Peter Sharples, but take care, he's a dangerous activist. So don't talk about politics. Don't talk about politics. What the fuck? Going to talk about what? The weather? How many children do you have? It's not very interesting. So finally, they introduced me, and they make a fantastic aka, this war dance. There was a moon, and after we spend maybe 2 hours, and we just talk about politics. So my first question was, what do you think about the globalization? And we talk about that. And I'm from Europe, and there is a lot of things. There is a very important thing for me. I try to, when I write books about New Zealand, for example, it takes me 4 years to write a book because I need time to discover the culture and the story too. And, but there is something that I try to do. So I am an outsider, but I try to be an insider. All my hero, for example, there is a Maori. My hero is not a French guy or a guy from Europe. He's a Maori. So I try to be in the mood, in the brain, and in the body of a Maori man. So it's not very easy. So I need time.
But how do you manage to do that? Tell us.
Yes, I try. I don't know if I succeed, but I try. And there is a word that I can. There was a word, I don't know if it's good in English. It's ethnocentrism. Do you understand ethnocentrism? When you think from your own culture, when you want to discover another culture, but finally you think with your own culture.
Because you think the world revolves around you.
Yeah. So I try to do. I try to be.
To not do that.
Yes.
Yeah. Ali, do you think it's possible for somebody like Caryl to, through words, really approach the reality of, like, for example, in his case, that it was the Maori culture, but could it be the Aboriginal culture?
You have to excuse me, I've arrived a bit ill.
Yeah. Should Lionel, maybe you want to answer this question?
Yeah, well, you know, like a lot of people believe that the Maori people belong to New Zealand. I mean, I have a lot of Maori brothers and sisters too. But the Moriori's come from there, really. And we have a dreaming in Australia called a Yili. And the Yili dreaming is when the dark people went over to Moriori, the Moriori people are the dark people from there, and then the Maori people came there. I don't know if you discovered that.
Yeah.
And but the Maori people have a prejudiced thing towards the Moriori people, right? Because they are the dark-skinned people of that country there in the beginning, that original people, you know. And we believe that they came from our dreaming anyway. But coming back to what was your thing? Yeah.
whether
I don't believe that. It's like when the movie Australian came out by Nicole Kidman, right? And when she acted in that movie, she went over to Europe and she started playing the yidaki, the didgeridoo, everywhere. And it insulted a lot of Aboriginal men who belong to this instrument, right? And we just don't believe that that is possible for a white woman to take up all their fame and their little culture thing, what she has, right? And go around and prostitute our culture to the world. I mean, prostitution of our culture by even writers in Australia, white writers in Australia, is on the rampage from long time ago and still being taught today. It's like the colonialistic kind of teaching or neo-colonialistic kind of teaching in the present day is so advanced in Australia that it keeps the government in power to make decisions through their constitution, which the constitution is very racist towards, even present day in the constitution, towards other nationalities in Australia, especially on Aboriginal people. They use this as a discrimination. The Attorney General comes out and he says, I'm proud to be a bigot, you know, which gives permission. So all this kind of thing what Aboriginal writers are doing today in the country, even traditional writers are trying to come back and correct a lot of the historical writers and all the white writers in the country of Australia that are writing things on it. They're experts. They know everything. They're the professionals, you know. And I'm not saying that I'm a racist. They're the ones who've been producing this racist thing all the time in the world. I mean, they're experts, you know, wherever they go. And when you get people who have never been to university, never got a degree, our storytellers are professionals. Our storytellers are professors, you know, and they're not being recognized as much as they should be in terms of giving the balance of life and the balance of wisdom in the country. A little tiny bit has been happening, but it's been too apologetic like Quakers in America.
Ali, do you agree with this, and how does it impact your writing?
I think maybe the process can occur in fiction, but like Lionel said, in non-fiction, in real life, it's a dangerous thing, and I'm saying that from an Australian point of view. I think often...
Ali, put the mic.
Sorry, I'm so afraid I'm going to cough again. I think that often what I've seen in that process, it's like, maybe it's intentional, maybe it's unconscious, but it's like a genocide of thought, because the original thought of of an ancient culture that's deep-seated in the land, because we belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to us. So again, in the non-fiction, if people are writing that, that's one of the big things that gets missed. And
well, can I just make a quote here, because
just seeing your thing, guerrilla poetry. So I was wondering whether you would define yourself as guerrilla poets or political poets. Probably you're not on
I'm
the
an
same.
all-round poet. Sister, you know, I destroyed the English language, you know. I destroyed colonialism. But basically, I wanted to do this quote here. Every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul and an inferior complex has been created by the death and brutal of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation. Franz Fanon wrote that, you know. So, you know, like, I think poetry really, for Aboriginal Australia, should not really get into romanticism or into commercialism poetry. Like, we get this motherfucking thing from America, all this rap stuff, and we get all this British bitchery kind of stuff, and the European Shakespeare kind of stuff coming into our country when you got the government in power now, you know, making all these legislations in government that's very oppressive and exploitive to our land, and as well as our culture, like they making us retreat into or accept a standard English in schools. You know, what I'm trying to say is basically that it's not helping us, none of this English. You know.
I know what you mean. And then Caryl, it was just
I understand his anger.
yes.
But you know, who said anger? You said anger. You know, don't judge me on anger, bro.
I don't judge
you. Know,
you.
it's just the way I speak, the way I express myself. Anger is important in Australia to protest against what's happening in Australia. We're trying to have a referendum at the moment to get our people recognised in Australia under the Constitution of Australia and try and rewrite bits and pieces of the Constitution. Now, if you had a people that in 1967 that were given vote rights and made us vote for white parties all over the years, and in the present day our people are blindfolded by the political system, right? Naturally you're going to get angry, you know, but you got to have discipline and anger.
What do you have to say to that, Caryl?
Yeah, that's why I haven't got the pretension to write like Maori or Aboriginal or Zulu people, but that's why I try to I write crime novels. I made just a focus on a country. It can be Argentina, South Africa, or New Zealand, and all my characters talked about this country. And for example, in New Zealand, if we are talking about New Zealand, there is 40 different characters in my books. Some of them are Pākehā, so white people, and some of them are Maori. And it's a way, the crime novels, to my mind, it's a way to talk about all the problems, all the history, all the social problems of this country. And when there is a first native people who live in this country, I try to explain all their pain, all their history, and the way they are being destroyed most of the time.
Can you explain the anger too?
I've got an anger for that.
I think there's many different levels of anger. There's anger and fairness. There's brutal anger, and sometimes there's a motivational anger. I wrote. I'm just going to share the first verse of this poem that I published. Now, this is a funny poem, Out Bush. This is Aboriginal humour, and yet I can't seem to convince many people that it's just black humour. Let's get married, she laughed, as she stabbed him in the shoulder. Sure thing, he laughed, as they walked to the hospital, a half-worn sock stuffed in the knife hole. Now, in Alice Springs, we'd be rolling on the ground with laughter. That's a funny poem. But again, it's that different way of thinking about things, and maybe judging things at a first glance that can't allow many people to see that as a funny poem.
How is your poetry received, or how was it received in the first place when you started, and how is it received now? Have things changed?
Initially, my poetry was noticed by mainstream Australia, and so I travelled a lot out of the desert to festivals.
So there is a lot of curiosity or interest. There's a lot of interest.
There was a lot of interest, and I guess I was a little bit shy, even though I had family permissions for my poetry. But it was a really fantastic moment when we did launch Little Bit Long Time in 2009 in Alice Springs. One of the main families who gave me permission for one of my better-known poems, they walked 7 miles from their little tin sheds to come to that book launch, and many Aboriginal people came, and that's who I write for primarily, and I would like to think that there's been a little ripple effect from that other people from the Aboriginal people from the desert have seen myself and Lionel and other Aboriginal poets up on the stage, and just by the visual, thinking, wow, we can do that.
Yeah, no, my poetry is very well known in Australia, in the outback communities. I just came back from Barralula, from Tennant Creek, and outback communities and that. Are starting to. They are starting to understand my poetry in terms of political writing, because I more or less used up English and tried to put about 3 different standards in the English to understand what I really mean in Aboriginal discussion. people in Australia, yes, I'm pretty accepted there, even in the white Australian and even in the multicultural community. Are starting to accept a lot of my writings in universities and colleges, on some of the state school, even preschools, because I write poetry in terms of children's stories too, and get out poetry in that way, in trying to give authenticity to the dream time in the present day of people understanding what dream time is about, so that they can live their lives a much more better way. And I think that with my poetry, it helps them understand what is politics, and it helps them understand that no, he's not really wanting us to join a political party. He wants us to join a world-class, international, indigenous poetry house that will bring people together and cause that unity and equality.
And Caryl, before this session, you were also explaining to me that you're trying to very much to explain to a non-indigenous audience some concepts that are key concepts to look at the world in a different way. Could you tell us a bit about that?
So I am an outsider, so when I arrive in a country, I have to discover the culture, not only the first native culture, but all the culture. But to my mind, the most important, when you go to Argentina, South Africa, and Australia or New Zealand, it's this country has been there is a colonization from European people, so it's almost the same. It's almost the same from Europe. So the most interesting to me, it's to discover the first native culture. And about the Maori, when they arrive in New Zealand, they kill the first native, the Maori, we were talking about that. And there is some word which just exists in their own language, and it doesn't mean anything for European people.
Just give us an example.
Yes.
The example you gave me earlier.
Yeah, my pronunciation will be absolutely awful, but it's something like the Tarongawe. In Maori, it means the way you are on the land. And you notice, you told about that, the most different things, and yes, to my mind, the most important things, the big difference between Western country and first native country, it's in Europe or Western country, we think that the land belongs to us. And in first native, it's always we belongs to the land. So it changed absolutely everything, and that's why we can't understand in Europe, for example, we can't understand what does it mean, the Taongawe, this word so important for Maori people, the way you are on the land. And when you discover all the world like this, and that's why they try to learn even to Maori people their own language. If they just speak English, they're going to be like me, just an ignorant, somebody who doesn't know what does it mean, and that's why, to my mind, I love to discover that kind of difference. It makes me less stupid.
Ali, you wanted to react?
I think in all fairness, as a writer, you do have the freedom to write whatever you choose. I definitely want that freedom. But as an Aboriginal writer in Australia, we are bound by resistance and healing, giving voice to that. And I really welcome the day when we have a ripple effect and mentored the younger generation of Aboriginal people that are interested in writing, and we start writing plays and scripts and books, putting the mirror in reverse when our kids feel brave enough to try and get into the skin of a non-Indigenous person and start writing from there. I'm sure that won't be well received at first, but for many of us it'll be the best stuff that we've heard.
Oh, interesting. I was wondering, let's go back to literature itself and the language you use, because it seems to me that you're mixing in a very clever way some Aboriginal terms, words, or way of thinking, and with something completely universal, like the death of a father or something like this. So how about the language? How specific is it?
I think when I first started writing, that was after the long journey to find my family. And I was in Alice Springs in the centre, and then out at Tichikala, living in a community totally surrounded by family and Aboriginal kinship. And when you're on traditional country, the land really talks and sings. And so I think a lot of my early poetry was influenced by that song. Well, they're my favourite poems. And the old people started teaching me as I began to travel more how to carry that song with me. So, I think, you know, as in my career, I was only using nouns first. I want to be growing our original language into my literature, sort of as a realisation of my actual journey, that I was very late in finding my family. I was in my mid-30s, and as I grow, I want to be able to include, as my knowledge of original language grows, so it'll show in my literature.
And since the theme of our session is take power, would you say, this is a question for the three of you, that you've actually witnessed that your writings have had an impact and changed something on the audience or the behavior of your readers, or just the way they look at the world?
Well, see, in Aboriginal Australia, it's an oral tradition. They keep on saying that, oral tradition.
But you have books.
Yeah, art and oral tradition and song and dance and all the spear up and all the boomerang, chuck the spear with the woomera. Yes, that is true. That's our culture. But as modern day Aborigine writers, we are trying to get our fluent speaking Aboriginal people. We had 500 different languages before the white man came. Now it's all dwindled down to about 150, and about 50 is fluently spoken in Australia. And what we are trying to do is revitalise other languages in the areas of where it's been detribalised, and basically the people who are speaking the language all the time and singing languages and that, we're trying to teach their children to read in the language, to write in the language, and to read the language as well.
Is it the case all the children are?
Oh yeah, the next generation basically should have the opportunity to write in our language and to read in our language. And this is more prevalent than 100% standard English coming into these schools, which we found in statistics in Australia that the younger children who are learning the language and reading in the language find it much more appreciative for the English to use it as a tool later on, so that they can communicate with other Australians in Australia.
Yeah. And Caryl, as far as you're concerned, of course your books haven't been translated into Maori language, I'm afraid. So you haven't been able to sort of see how they react. But what has been the impact on your European readership?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure that my books change everything in the world. Sorry for that. But
they are not meant for you to take power.
But I think a lot of readers they discover another culture or another country. So maybe they are concerned for 10 hours, just the time to read the book. But after they told me, I didn't know that in New Zealand it was like this. I didn't know that in South Africa it was like that. So maybe there are.
So you're fighting some stereotypes as well.
Yeah, maybe it's got something more. And when they heard Maori or Mapuche, maybe they go, I know what's it. I know it's this country or this place. They got their problem because I read this book.
And they understand it's more complex.
Yeah, but
it's
a feedback from Europe, not from the first.
See, I've read that in India they have the Gore as the poetry of the anthem, and basically I've read from a lot of indigenous people of India that and other people that they should have an indigenous anthem in India, which should be projected to the people. And that's the same in Australia. That's what we're trying to get the Australian people to accept, that it's possible now that we can combine all the different languages and make an anthem, and then be really appreciated by the multicultural people. It's like having a Aboriginal passport, which we have available in Australia for people to get an Aboriginal passport to get back into the country and pay us the tax and pay us, our communities, the things. I mean, this is the way what's happening in Australia.
Ali, you have you experience the two cultures, of course. So I was wondering when I was listening to you earlier, your adoptive family told you about the Aborigines culture you were originally from. Or how did they behave? And did they meet your mother, your biological mother?
We were always told that we were adopted, and we were always told that we were special. And when we started occurring racism at school, then we sort of wondered what this label of special was, because the racism was pretty extreme in the 60s and the 70s when I was going to school. Unfortunately, my mothers didn't get a chance to meet, but my adopted mum, Frida, she's opened the doors to many other members of my family. There's one beautiful moment when I was in Adelaide for such a short time, and we just grabbed some pizzas and went round there, and then she was getting a bit bossy because she's German, remember, and said, we always say grace before a feed. And one of them was an Inkara. He was an Aboriginal like minister, and he laughed and he said, we're all Lutherans. And one young guy who rarely speaks, he gave the blessing in language that day. For me, that was a pivotal moment of my two families coming together, and what can be achieved beyond literature. It's another reason why I write. I think, if there's a commonality here, is that we're all writing to be published to bring attention to Mapachu and Maori and Aboriginal, because I think the world's moved into sort of an ecology of extinction. We're becoming very used to animals being extinct and plants being extinct, peoples being extinct, and languages, traditional medicines, I'm sure that there's a shared essence here that we're all writing as a way to counteract that.
Okay, well, thank you. That was very moving. Maybe we could take a few questions from the floor now. I'm sure some of you want to, over there.
It would have been good if we met you beforehand.
Thank you. I would like to first quote or maybe reference three things which were said by Ali, Caryl and Lionel. Ali had said that we belong to the land. Land does not belong to us. I'm sure she said that. One thing that Caryl had said that regarding the politics, the globalization which was discussed. And Lionel had said that English is not helping out the children over there in Australia, the Aboriginal people, because probably the marginalization of the students over there from such communities is obviously there. Now the thing is, we also discussed about how these three factors play along, and we have to understand that since the land is not belonging to us, we cannot give it a name. We cannot give it a language. We give language to our culture, right? So the thing is, when globalization is happening, colonialism has led each and every one of us to exchange things. How do we balance this equation where we have to suffer loss of many diversities and come to a commonality? And we have to accept it. So how do we do that? Or at what point do we draw the line?
Okay, who wants to take this question? It's a tough
The
one.
question?
I'm not sure if I understood everything that was asked, but the world is so obsessed with mining and the raping of lands, traditional lands, foresting or whatever, the Amazon, wherever. But in Australia, mining is mainstream, and they're our churches. So for a quick response would be, well, there must be a compromise that that our culture and our
and their culture, you're a terrorist.
Let's take another question.
You said that we should promote our indigenous cultures and music and song, but one of the problems we face in India is that the youth don't want to because they have to learn in English if they have to get a job or if they have to survive, basically. So even their parents don't want them to learn about their culture and their background and all, they just want to move ahead. How do you think we can counteract that and still keep, the culture active while globalization is happening and people are not interested in their cultures?
Well, yeah, that's like us in Australia too with the mining companies. The mining companies are pretty much influencing a lot of communities to get jobs there. And for them to get jobs there, they have to learn English and they have to study English. And what the universities in the cities and that, the intellectuals and the professors and that, what they've been doing is going out into the remote communities and grabbing the scholars out of the remote communities and taking them into those universities. They learn good English. They already know some of their culture and their language, but they learn good English in that, and then they coerce them into privatization, into private jobs and into like a set class. And so what we have is the government has set up advisory councils where they appoint certain members in Aboriginal communities to make decisions over everyone in the country because they know the English, they know the law, right? And they, what we call jackies and Marys, like coconuts. We call them coconuts where they, black here but white on the inside or whatever, and that's how we got them in Australia. So what we're frightened of, or what I'm frightened of as a writer in Australia, is that the multiculturals don't turn out like the white man in Australia. Because you got Indians in Australia that are looking down on Aboriginal people, squashing us too, and you got Asians, and you got Chinese, you got even Maoris, and Islanders and that, who think that they're the ones, that they know more about culture and their language than us in Australia. We have to put up with that. And then when we come back and we speak English, and we write in the English, man, they freak out in their superiority. They can't stand that. And it's important for us to use the English, of course, but then you have to, because English has no natural thing. It has no natural heartbeat for us. When the language comes in, that has a natural heartbeat for us, and that makes it have a rhythm and a flow.
I think it's a matter of education. My grandmothers and the old people who I met when I first found the family and went into the desert were remarkable people. They lived with the two worlds remarkably well, and they encouraged their children and grandchildren to be able to do that. They were, maybe almost pioneers at it. Because unfortunately, we're stuck on an island, and we have to learn English to be able to provide for your family, or even to be able to provide for yourself. There needs to be English. So I think it's a bit of education. Of course, the wariness is still there, and like Lionel was saying about coconuts, it's very difficult when your enemy is someone that looks like you. And when I was in Canada, they even had the same terminology. Over there, they're apples, red on the outside, white on the inside. So there's that commonality of fear and suspicion too. I think if Indigenous people are empowered to be strong in their culture, they will find the way of the compromise, and a healthy compromise, because the white man offers a compromise, and then a compromise, and then a compromise, but the compromise is always sort of on the Indigenous point, and not really from there. It's not a healthy compromise.
No, we don't want people in Australia writing in English in the structural forms as Shakespeare or any other European styles of writings or English styles of writing. Australians who are not non-Indigenous are starting to try and write in a different style of their own to the Western styles of writing. They're trying to get there. But it's us Indigenous people in Australia that are teaching them their own English through our writings and even through our speaking too, right? We're teaching them English that they never ever known about before in the simplistic way, in a very intelligent way. We're doing it. We're teaching them. We're trying to correct them and trying to undo the colonization to decolonizing them.
We still have time for a last question. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, over there.
Check one. Yep. Yes, I'm just curious if you could speak to, you said you've traveled to Canada, which of course also has its own brutal colonial past. I come from Vancouver, Coast Salish territories, and so I'm curious if you could speak to any solidarity movements that have been happening globally that you've been a part of, because I've also heard of some great solidarity movement that's happened with Aboriginals in Australia and refugee claimants coming into Australia. If you could just expand on those, I'd love to hear about that.
My time in Canada was quite limited, but it was just before the First Nations were signing off on the reparations for their equivalent of the stolen generation. So I went there and I met some chiefs. And Phil Fontaine, he was national chief at the time, he brought a delegation out to Central Australia and other parts of Australia. So that was really trying to open up the conversation for stolen generation histories, shared, you know, like similar and shared, and looking forward at ways of healing and also having chats about reparations and other legalities. I'm not really sure where that sits now. My literary career has taken me away from those grassroots movements. But I know in Australia, you know, even if it's not an organised, seen as an organised organisation, the voice of grassroots is still linked. And even, you know, we all hate Facebook, but Facebook's really good for combining voices and whatever. So on January the 26th, there's been a call going out for some months now, and it's Republican Day in India, it's Australia Day in Australia. So most Aboriginal people call it Survival Day or Invasion Day. And in Australia, we have the 10 Embassy in Canberra. Over 40 years ago, 4 young men sat under a beach umbrella with the sign Aboriginal 10 Embassy. Well, the embassy is still tents. So I think that's a really good example of how the Australian government chooses to actually ignore dialogue with us, because we're still protesting from a tent site, and we're sure thousands of Aboriginal people will be gathering there today to give a voice.
Time is over.
No, I just wanted to say that in Australia we protested against the G20, and we had lots of support from Canadian natives and North American, Latin American natives, or natives all over Australia, right? All over the world, and united together against this kind of G20 thing that happened in Australia, because they slashed $500 million from Aboriginal funds and paid out $600 million for the G20. I mean, yes, we have connections with Akwesasne notes and with North American natives for many years. They have a struggle too for, in the same essence of us and the logic of us, in that we never ceded our country in our sovereigns that we keep in our hearts and in our culture.
Time is over, unfortunately. It was very interesting, and I have to thank you all. You'll be signing your books at the booth outside, I guess. So if some of you want to continue this discussion, it's possible outside.
of the
time.
session on Take Power. We'd like to thank Ms. Ali Cobby Eckerman, Mr. Caryl Ferey, Mr. Lionel Fogarty, and Ms. Florence Noiville. We have a half-an-hour recess, after which we'll begin our next session. And until then, you can enjoy at the Rajnigandha front lawns, you have a book launch of the book called The Seduction of Delhi by Abhay K. And at Fourth Samvad, you have the Pushkin Prize. So if anybody wants to go enjoy that, most welcome. Our next session would begin in half an hour. Thank you again. We'd like all our speakers to also accept a small token of our love and appreciation.